The day Caroline Easton buried her husband, the sky above Laramie, Wyoming, was the clearest blue she had ever seen, and she decided then that she would never trust beautiful things again. That was 3 years ago. The year was 1882, and the town of Millhaven, a modest but stubborn collection of wooden storefronts and dust-caked streets nestled along the eastern edge of Wyoming Territory, had watched Caroline shrink into herself like a candle burning from the inside out. She had come to Millhaven as a bride, full of laughter and plans, at the age of 24. She left that version of herself somewhere on the trail between the life she had imagined and the grave she had dug with her own 2 hands beside a creek that ran clear and cold and utterly indifferent. Thomas Easton had been a good man. He had been a rancher with careful eyes and a steady voice, and he had loved Caroline the way a man loves something he cannot believe he deserves. Pneumonia had taken him in February of 1879, swift and merciless, the way the territory took everything it wanted. It did not ask, it simply took. And what it left behind was Caroline Easton, 24 years old, with a modest ranch that was too big for one woman, a horse named Solomon, and a grief so enormous that she had to press her palms flat against the kitchen table every morning just to convince herself she was still made of solid matter. She had kept the ranch going. That was the first thing people said about her in Millhaven, that Caroline Easton kept her ranch going. She hired 2 hands, Jasper and Old Pete, and she worked alongside them through seasons that blurred into each other. And she sold cattle, and she mended fences, and she did every practical thing a living person was supposed to do. But she did it the way a woman moves through water, with everything slowed and muffled and strange. The neighbors stopped inviting her to socials, not out of cruelty, but because she would come and stand at the edges of rooms and look at the dancing couples, and something in her face would make the music feel inappropriate, like laughing in a church. She wore black for the first year, which was proper, then gray for the second year, which was expected. By the 3rd year, the women of Millhaven had quietly given up waiting for Caroline to reach for color again. She was 27 now, and the grief had settled so deep into her bones that she sometimes forgot it was grief at all. It had simply become the shape of her, the way she held her shoulders, the way she answered questions with the minimum number of words, the way she looked at the horizon every evening without longing, just observation, the way you look at a wall. It was in October of 1882 that Orville Wallace rode into Millhaven with nothing but a bedroll, a well-worn saddle on a chestnut mare named Clover, and a reputation in 3 other towns that he neither confirmed nor denied. He was 31 years old, lean in the way that men who work outdoors become lean, not from deprivation but from constant use. He had dark hair that curled slightly at his collar because he had gone too long between barbershops, and eyes the color of creek water after rain, that particular shade of gray-green that shifts depending on the light. There was a scar along his jaw that he had gotten at 16 in a fence dispute that had briefly turned into a knife dispute, and he wore it with no particular drama. He did not swagger. That was the first thing people noticed about Orville Wallace. He did not have the wide-legged strut of a man performing his own legend. He walked like a man who knew exactly where he was going even when he didn't, which was a quality that commanded a certain involuntary respect. He tied Clover outside the Millhaven General Store, stretched the road out of his back, and went inside to buy flour, coffee, salt, and a block of hard cheese that he intended to eat slowly over the following week. He was not planning to stay in Millhaven. He was passing through on his way to take a foreman position on the Callaway spread up near the Montana border, and he needed supplies and perhaps one hot meal before he pushed north. The woman behind the counter of the general store was not Caroline Easton. It was Mrs. Beaumont, who was 60 years old and who handled every customer with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been doing the same thing for decades and saw no reason to embellish the experience. She informed Orville that he looked like he needed a bath and that the bathhouse was 2 doors down, which cost $0.25, and that the Caldwells' boarding house served supper at 6, and that it was worth the 50 cents. Orville thanked her with genuine warmth, because he was the kind of man who thanked people with genuine warmth, and he asked if there was any work to be found locally. Mrs. Beaumont gave him a look that contained a great deal of information in a small amount of space. "You might ask at the Easton Ranch," she said. "Caroline Easton lost one of her hands last month. Young Jasper went up to Cheyenne to find himself a wife and hasn't come back yet, which means she's down to Pete, who is 63 and held together mostly by stubbornness and coffee." Orville was not planning to stop in Millhaven. He said as much. But he asked where the Easton Ranch was anyway, because that was the kind of man he was, someone who collected information without necessarily committing to what he would do with it. He took his bath. He had the supper at Caldwell's, which was beef stew and cornbread and a slice of dried apple pie, and it was every bit worth the 50 cents. He sat at the long table alongside a traveling seed merchant named Horace, a young man who was passing through on his way to somewhere else, and a taciturn woman in a wool coat who said nothing, and appeared to be eating with the intensity of someone settling a personal grievance with their food. Orville ate slowly and listened to Horace talk about the exceptional quality of the spring wheat he was bringing up from Kansas, and he found himself thinking about the Easton Ranch and the widow who was running it with one old man and a lot of apparent determination. He told himself he would sleep on it. He slept on it. And in the morning, with the October air cold enough to see his breath and Clover stamping her impatience in the small corral behind the boarding house, he found himself saddling up and riding not north toward Montana, but east toward the Easton Ranch. The property announced itself before the house did. The fences were in good repair, which surprised him given what Mrs. Beaumont had implied about the workforce situation. The grass in the near pasture was grazed down evenly, suggesting someone was rotating the cattle with attention. The barn was freshly patched on the north wall. These were not the signs of a ranch barely holding together. They were the signs of a ranch being held together by someone working very hard. He heard her before he saw her. There was a sound of hammer on wood coming from behind the barn, a steady and deliberate rhythm, and he rode around the corner to find Caroline Easton on her knees in the dirt beside a section of fence that had rotted at the base post, pulling it free with a crowbar, and an expression of focused irritation that suggested the fence post had personally wronged her. She was wearing dungarees and a flannel shirt the color of old pine needles, with her dark auburn hair pulled back under a battered work hat. There was a smear of dirt along her left cheek, and both her hands were gloved. She did not look up when she heard Clover's hooves because she was in the middle of something, and she was clearly the kind of person who finished what she was in the middle of. "I'm not buying anything," she said to the ground, levering the post free with a grunt of effort. "I am not selling anything," Orville said. That made her look up. She took him in with the swift, appraising look of someone who has spent years assessing the relative trustworthiness of strangers from a position of necessary caution. She did not look frightened. She looked like she was calculating something. "Mrs. Beaumont at the general store said you might be needing a hand," he said. "I am looking for short-term work, a few weeks maybe through the month. I'm heading up toward the Montana border, but I am in no particular hurry." "What kind of experience do you have?" Her voice was even, not unfriendly but not warm either, the voice of a woman who had learned to keep her inflection neutral the way you keep a gate latched. "Cattle work, fence work, barn work, horse work," he said. "I am not fancy, but I am reliable and I do not complain." She studied him for another moment. Then she stood up, pulled off one glove, and extended her hand. "Caroline Easton, the pay is $1 a day and meals. You sleep in the bunkhouse. Pete is the other hand, and he sets the rules in there." "What is your name?" "Orville Wallace." She shook his hand with a firm grip. Her eyes were the color of amber, that specific warm brown that catches the light and holds it. He noticed that she smiled with her mouth but not with those eyes, as if the machinery for a real smile had been disconnected somewhere along the way. He did not remark on this. He said, "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Easton," and she said, "Start this afternoon if you want," and went back to her fence post. He started that afternoon. Pete was exactly as Mrs. Beaumont had described him, which was to say he was 63 years old and held together by stubbornness and coffee. He was also funny in a dry, barely moving his face kind of way, and he knew cattle the way some men know cards, with an instinctive fluency that had been built up over so many years it had stopped being knowledge and started being something more like weather sense. Pete took one look at Orville's hands and said, "Good, real calluses. I was afraid she was going to hire another soft boy from back east who thinks ranching is an adventure." Orville said, "I have never thought anything was an adventure. Adventures generally mean someone made a planning error." Pete laughed, which was apparently a rare enough occurrence that it made the barn cat look up from where it had been sleeping on a hay bale. The first week passed with the clean efficiency of men who know how to work together without needing to talk about working together. Orville took to the rhythm of the Easton ranch quickly, because he had worked enough different ranches to understand that every property has its own logic, its own daily grammar, and the fastest way to be useful is to learn that grammar without imposing your own. He watched how Caroline had organized things, the order in which she preferred to move through the morning chores, the specific way she liked the cattle gates positioned, the fact that she had a system for tracking which sections of fence had been checked most recently, a little chalk mark on a stone at each post corner, and he followed her system without being asked, which she noticed without commenting on. She was up before him every morning. That was a fact he established on the third day, when he rose at 5 in the dark and found the kitchen lamp already lit and coffee already made. She was sitting at the table with a ledger and an expression of focused concentration, doing the accounts, and she looked up when he came in and pointed at the coffee without saying anything. He poured himself a cup and took it outside to watch the dark edge of the horizon turn pink, and when she came out 20 minutes later with her own cup to check on the horses, they stood in a comfortable silence that he found unexpectedly easy. He had expected the silence to feel like a wall. Some silences do. Some silences are the kind that have sharp edges and make you conscious of every sound you're not making. But Caroline's silences were different. They were the silences of a person who had simply run out of performance, who had stopped filling space with words for the sake of filling it. There was something in those quiet mornings that felt more honest than most conversations he had sat through. He did not push. That was Orville's approach to Caroline Easton in those first weeks, because he could see plainly that she was a woman in the middle of something that had nothing to do with the fence posts or the cattle ledgers. He did not know the shape of it yet. He could see only the effect of it, the way she moved through her days with her shoulders slightly hunched inward, as if she were braced for something. The way she looked at couples on the main street of Millhaven, on the 2 occasions he accompanied her in for supplies, with an expression that was not quite longing and not quite bitterness, but something that lived in the territory between the two. He asked Pete about it, carefully, obliquely. "She lost her husband a few years back," Pete said, not looking up from the harness he was oiling. "Thomas Easton, good man. It hit her hard and it stayed hard. I have been with this ranch 6 years, and I can tell you that woman has not once, not one single time, let herself be unhappy out loud. She keeps it all internal, like she has decided that showing it would be a kind of failure." He paused. "I do not think she is right about that, but I have learned not to say so." Orville thought about this for several days. He was not a man given to romantic schemes or calculated seductions. He was a man who believed, privately and simply, that most good things between people happen because someone chooses to pay attention. Not dramatic attention, not theatrical attention, just the ordinary, unglamorous kind where you actually look at someone and register what you see. What he saw when he looked at Caroline Easton was a woman of remarkable competence, of genuine intelligence, of quiet humor that flashed sometimes when she wasn't guarding herself closely enough. He saw someone who had loved deeply enough that losing it had reorganized her entire internal architecture. And he saw, underneath the grief that had calcified into habit, something that the grief was sitting on top of, something that had not gone away just because she had been covering it for 3 years. He was not sure yet what it was. But he was curious, in the way that some men are curious about a locked door, not because they want to break in, but because they genuinely wonder what is on the other side. It was on a Thursday evening in the third week of October that the first real conversation happened. Not the practical exchanges of working life, not the brief logistical discussions about cattle and fence lines and the weather moving in from the north. A real conversation. Caroline had come out to the corral fence after supper with 2 cups of coffee, which she had not done before, and she handed one to Orville with a directness that suggested she had made a decision about it and was not second-guessing it. He took the cup and leaned on the fence beside her, and they watched Solomon in the paddock, Thomas's old horse, now 17 years old and gray around the muzzle but still solid. "Pete says you have been to Montana before," she said. "3 years ago," Orville said. "I worked a season on a spread near Miles City." "What was it like?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Big," he said. "Even by Western standards it is big. The sky sits differently up there, more of it, like someone has pushed the horizon back an extra 10 miles in every direction." She was quiet for a moment. "Thomas always wanted to go," she said. And then she went very still, like she had said something she hadn't meant to say, and he watched her retreat from it internally, watched her pull the mention back toward herself, ready to make it smaller or apologize for it. He did not let her. "What did Thomas want to see up there?" he asked, easy and natural, as though talking about her dead husband was a normal thing, which it was, because the man had existed and had mattered, and pretending otherwise was a courtesy that served no one. She blinked. People did not ask about Thomas in a casual tone. People either avoided him entirely or asked with the heavy, walking on eggshells reverence that made her feel like she was supposed to perform her widowhood for their comfort. Orville had done neither. He had just asked a direct question like it was information he was genuinely interested in. "He wanted to see the northern Cheyenne land," she said, after a moment. "He had read about it. He had a book with photographs, daguerreotypes actually, of the territory. He used to look at them at the kitchen table after supper." She paused. "He was a man who read a great deal for a rancher." "Plenty of ranchers read," Orville said mildly. "Anyone who tells you different is probably someone who doesn't read and is embarrassed about it." That surprised a short laugh out of her. It was small and she recovered from it quickly, but he registered it with quiet satisfaction, the way you register a bird landing on a branch, something alive coming closer. "You don't look at the photographs anymore?" he asked. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "No," she said. And then unexpectedly, "They are in the trunk at the foot of my bed. I have not opened it in 2 years." "That makes sense," he said simply. She looked at him. "Most people would say I should open it, that it is healthy, that I should allow myself to remember." "Most people," Orville said, "have opinions about other people's grief that have more to do with their own comfort than anything else. A trunk stays closed until you are ready to open it. That is not avoidance. That is just knowing yourself." She stared at him for a long moment with those amber eyes, and in that look there was something complicated happening, a reassessment of some kind, a recalibration. Then she looked back at Solomon in the paddock and said, "He named the horse after the biblical king because he said a horse that old ought to have a grand name." "How old was Solomon when Thomas got him?" 12, she said, "which is an age when most men would not have bought a horse at all. Thomas said he still had good years in him, and he was right." She was quiet. Thomas was usually right about things. "What kind of things was he wrong about?" Orville asked. She blinked again. Another unexpected question. She thought about it honestly, which he could see was something she had not allowed herself to do for a long time, because thinking about Thomas's flaws required thinking about Thomas as a full human being rather than as a sanctified absence. "He was stubborn about asking for help," she said slowly. "When the fence line in the south pasture was failing, He spent 2 months fighting it himself rather than hiring someone to help. He thought that accepting help meant he was admitting he couldn't manage. "A lot of men are like that," Orville said. "A lot of men are wrong like that," she said, and there was a faint warmth in her voice, something that was almost affection directed at a man 3 years dead. She caught herself and looked briefly uncertain, as if expressing anything other than pure unadorned sorrow about Thomas was somehow disloyal. Orville said, "It is all right to remember the stubborn part too." She looked at him sharply. He held the look without flinching, easy and steady, and after a moment the sharpness in her eyes softened into something more complicated. "You are a strange kind of man," she said. "I have been called worse," he said. She almost smiled. The machinery didn't quite connect, but it came close, and he could see the shape of what the smile would have been, and he found it remarkable. They went inside when the cold finally insisted on itself, and he did not see her again until the next morning, when the coffee was already made and the ledger was open on the table, and they settled back into the comfortable working grammar of the ranch as if the conversation at the fence had not happened. But it had happened, and they both knew it, and something in the air between them was very slightly different, the way air feels different after the first real rain of a dry season. November came in cold and certain, the way November does in Wyoming, with no apology and no gradual introduction. The first snow fell on a Sunday, light but persistent, and Orville and Pete spent the day reinforcing the barn against the draft and ensuring the cattle had adequate shelter in the south pasture. Caroline worked alongside them, moving hay bales with an efficiency that Orville had stopped being surprised by. He had stopped being surprised by anything she could do, because the list was extensive and continued to grow. She could ride as well as any man he had worked with. She could read terrain with a rancher's eye, knowing which slopes would ice first, which gullies would flood in a spring thaw, which sections of range would support the cattle best in winter. She could calculate feed costs in her head faster than he could do it on paper. She had learned, out of necessity, to do the thing that Thomas had been too proud to do, which was to ask for help when she needed it, because she had discovered in the early days of running the ranch alone that pride was expensive and the ranch could not afford the cost. She was also, he was learning, quietly funny. It came out in small ways, in a dry remark about the weather, in the deadpan delivery of an observation about the preacher's new hat, which she described to Pete as looking like something a pigeon had assembled by accident. Pete had wheezed with laughter, and she had maintained her expression of absolute seriousness, which made it funnier. Orville had laughed too, and she had looked at him with a brief, startled expression, as if the sound of his laugh had surprised her, not unpleasantly. There was an evening in early November when the snow was keeping everyone inside, and Pete had gone to bed early with the particular determination of a man who believes strongly in sleep as a solution to most problems, and Orville and Caroline sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, and she was mending a work shirt, and he was reading a month-old newspaper from Cheyenne that he had found in the bunkhouse. "The government is talking about opening more Indian land for settlement," he said, not looking up from the paper. "Again." "They are always talking about that," she said, without looking up from her mending. "It is wrong," he said, simply and without drama. "The Cheyenne and the Arapaho and the Sioux, they were here long before any of us. Taking what is theirs and dressing it up in legislation does not make it any less a taking." She looked up. "Most men in this territory do not say that. Most men in this territory have a vested interest in not saying it," he said. "That does not make them right." She studied him for a moment. "Thomas said something similar," she said quietly. "He said that the Homestead Act was written to benefit the people who wrote it, and that the Indians had the clearest legal claim to this land of anyone, and they were the ones being told they had no claim at all." He said it quietly because saying it loudly in Millhaven in 1878 would not have gone well. "It would not go well now either," Orville said, "but it is still true." "Do you think things will change?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. I think things change slowly and badly, and usually only after someone has been badly wronged enough times that ignoring it becomes impossible. And even then, the change is incomplete and the debt is not paid." He paused. "That is an honest answer, but not a hopeful one." "I prefer honest answers to hopeful ones," she said. "I know you do," he said, and then caught himself because it was a presumptuous thing to say about a woman he had known for less than a month. But she didn't look offended. She looked at him with a kind of careful consideration, as if she were measuring something. "You pay attention," she said. "I try to," he said. She went back to her mending, but the set of her shoulders was different, slightly less closed, slightly less braced, and the silence that followed was the kind that has warmth in it. The second week of November brought a situation that accelerated everything by necessity. A fence line in the far east pasture, nearly 4 miles from the main house, gave way in the night after a section of ground shifted in the cold, and by morning 12 head of cattle had wandered onto neighboring land, specifically onto the property of a man named Gerald Hatch, who was the kind of neighbor who was technically within his rights most of the time, but who exercised those rights with a mean-spirited enthusiasm that made even his legitimate positions feel hostile. Hatch was on his property's border when Caroline and Orville arrived, and he was standing with his arms crossed and an expression of elaborate patience that was designed to communicate that his patience was actually running quite thin. He was 50 years old, heavyset, with the prosperous look of a man who had done well for himself and had never entirely moved on from wanting people to know it. "Mrs. Easton," he said, with a slight emphasis on the Mrs. that was meant to remind everyone present of her status as a woman operating alone. "Your animals are on my land. I would be within my rights to hold them until you pay for the inconvenience." "You would be within your rights," Caroline agreed pleasantly. "And I would be within my rights to remind the county assessor that the survey stakes along our shared boundary line have not been confirmed since 1877, which means the eastern portions of what you call your land may be subject to review." She said it with no particular heat, as though she were discussing the weather. "Or we could simply agree that fences fail sometimes and neighbors help each other, and I will have the fence repaired by end of day today." There was a silence in which Hatch recalculated his position. He looked at Orville, who was sitting easy on Clover, and looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man who is present but has no stake in the outcome, which was a lie, but a convincing one. Hatch clearly wanted to push back, but equally clearly did not want to have a boundary dispute start, because boundary disputes in Wyoming in 1882 were expensive in time and money and goodwill. "By end of day," Hatch said, making it sound like a concession he was generously offering. "By end of day," Caroline confirmed, and turned her horse to start rounding up the cattle without waiting for any further response. They were a quarter mile away before Orville said, "The survey stakes comment." "Completely accurate," she said. "I had the records checked in 1880. Do you actually think there is a discrepancy?" "I have absolutely no idea," she said serenely, and the expression on her face was so close to mischief that he laughed out loud, a real unguarded laugh, and she turned to look at him with those amber eyes bright and surprised, and something in them warm and quick before she looked away again. They worked side by side for 4 hours fixing the fence, with Pete coming out after noon with the wagon carrying additional posts and wire. It was hard work in the cold, and by the time they were done, their breath was thick in the air and their hands were stiff inside the gloves. Caroline drove a fence post with a maul with the confident, accurate swing of someone who had done it many times before, and Orville held the post steady and watched her, and thought that she was the most self-possessed woman he had ever met, and that her self-possession was made of a particular kind of material, not arrogance or ease, but the hard-won certainty of someone who had been tested and had not broken. On the ride back, as the sun was going down in the cold yellow way it goes down in November in Wyoming, she said, without preamble, "Why are you still here?" He looked at her. "I told you I would stay through the month." "You told me you were heading to Montana," she said. "The Callaway spread. You mentioned it to Pete and he mentioned it to me. You should have been there 3 weeks ago." He was quiet for a moment. "The work here needed doing," he said. "You could find work north," she said. Her voice was neutral, but he could hear something underneath it, something careful, like she was asking a question she was not sure she wanted the full answer to. "I could," he agreed. "But I am here." She did not pursue it further. But that night, he sat in the bunkhouse with Pete snoring on the other side of the room, and he acknowledged to himself with the simple honesty of a man who does not generally bother lying to himself that he was staying because of Caroline Easton. Not because of some romantic calculation, not because he had decided to pursue her, but because being near her felt like being in the right place, the way sometimes you arrive somewhere you have never been and you feel, without any logic to support it, that this is where you were going all along. He was not a man who mistook loneliness for love. He had been lonely before and he knew what it felt like, and it felt like this, a quiet ache and the company of his own thoughts, and nothing particularly wrong with either. This was different. This was something that lived in his chest when he was around her, a kind of aliveness, an engagement, as if the whole world had turned up its contrast slightly. He was 31 years old and he had not been in love before. He had been fond of people. He had respected women and enjoyed their company, and had once, for a period of about 6 months, thought that a woman named Clara in Abilene might be someone he could build something with, until he discovered that Clara had a fiancé in St. Louis who she had neglected to mention, and the whole thing had dissolved without particular drama. But he had not been in love. He was aware, in the careful way that he was aware of most things, that what was happening to him now was in the general neighborhood of love, or at least its early approaches, and that it involved a woman who was wrapped in grief like a second skin, and who might not be anywhere near ready to consider removing it. He was a patient man. It was perhaps his most consistent quality. He had learned in 31 years of a life that had required a great deal of navigating, that the things worth having generally required a specific kind of patience, not the passive patience of simply waiting, but the active patience of being fully present without demanding an outcome. December arrived. He was still there. The month passed through its cold, steady rhythms. There was an afternoon in mid-December when a small crisis with the cattle, a young heifer who had gotten herself into serious trouble trying to navigate an icy drainage ditch, required both of them to wade into the cold muck up to their knees to get her free. They came back to the house covered in mud and ice water and laughing, actually laughing, both of them, because the heifer had made the most indignant sounds imaginable all the way back to the pasture, as though the entire incident were somehow their fault. They stood on the porch pulling off their boots, and the laughter gradually settled into warm, easy grins, and Caroline looked at Orville with those amber eyes entirely unguarded, and for a moment he saw all the way to the inside of her, to the woman underneath the grief and underneath the careful management and underneath all of it, and she was luminous. Then she caught herself and the careful composure came back like a curtain being drawn, and she said she would heat some water for washing up and went inside. But something had shifted. He could feel it the way you feel a change in the air pressure before a storm, not a threatening shift, a different kind. On Christmas Eve, which fell on a Sunday that year, the small community of Millhaven gathered at the church for a service that was partly religious and partly an excuse for people who had been isolated in the cold for weeks to look at each other's faces. Caroline went because she was a woman who kept up her social obligations regardless of how she felt about them, and she invited Orville because it would have been strange not to, and he went in his cleanest shirt and sat beside her in the third pew from the front. The singing was imperfect and warm. The preacher gave a sermon that was mercifully short. And then, afterward, in the church hall where Mrs. Caldwell and 2 other women had laid out apple cider and ginger cake, and a selection of cookies that represented the baking ambitions of half the town's women, Caroline stood near the window and watched the room with her usual careful distance. Orville stood beside her and they ate ginger cake, and he told her about a Christmas he had spent working a ranch in New Mexico, where the December weather was so warm it felt like April, and the ranch cook had made tamales for Christmas dinner, and how strange it was to celebrate a winter holiday in summer warmth. She told him about her first Christmas in Wyoming after marrying Thomas in 1876, when the snow had been so heavy they couldn't get to church, and Thomas had read the scripture at the kitchen table, and then they had eaten an entire apple pie between the two of them out of what she called festive irresponsibility. And she said it with such precise, particular fondness, with such warm specificity, that Orville could see it plainly. The two young people, the snow outside, the pie, the contentment. And he was glad she could say it without her voice breaking. It seemed like a victory of some kind, the ability to hold a good memory without it destroying you. "Do you miss him tonight in particular?" Orville asked quietly under the noise of the room. She was quiet for a moment. "I miss him every night," she said. "Tonight I miss the version of things that we were building. We were going to have children." She said it without melodrama. "We had talked about it. We were going to have a family and a bigger house eventually, and Thomas was going to read to them in that careful way he had of reading, very slow, very deliberate, like each word deserved consideration." She paused. "I miss the future more than the past, I think. That is the strangest part of it." Orville was very still beside her. "That makes sense," he said softly. "The past you actually had. The future was a promise that was broken." She turned and looked at him, and her eyes were bright but not wet, because she had made a private rule about not crying in public, and she held to it with iron discipline. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly what it is. A broken promise." She seemed slightly startled by the accuracy of the description, as if hearing it articulated clearly had given it a new kind of definition. "I have not thought of it in those words before." "Do the words help?" he asked. She considered it. "Yes," she said, "I think they do." A small girl ran past them, chasing another small girl, and the sound of their laughter broke the moment open, and Mrs. Beaumont materialized at Caroline's elbow, wanting to discuss the matter of the church roof fund, and Orville stepped back and let the conversation happen. But he carried the image of Caroline's face in that moment with him into the new year like something valuable. January of 1883 was fierce. Wyoming winters in the 1880s were not theoretical affairs. They were real and specific, and they killed things. 2 of the cattle died in the second week. Despite everything, and Orville and Pete worked through temperatures that dropped to 20 below zero on 3 consecutive nights, checking on the animals, keeping the water troughs from freezing solid, making sure the barn stayed tenable. Caroline was out there with them. She did not send her men out into the brutal cold while she sat by the fire. She was in her heaviest coat and her warmest gloves, and she was as present and physical as either of them, and this was, Orville had come to understand, simply who she was. Not performance, not proving something, just the fact of her. There was a night in the 3rd week of January when the cold was genuinely dangerous, and they had been out for 3 hours making the final check on the herd, and they came back to the house wind-burned and half-frozen, and Caroline made a pot of beef broth on the stove, and they sat around the kitchen table, all 3 of them, including Pete, who had been briefly convinced that his feet were going to fall off and was profoundly relieved to be inside. The warmth of the kitchen came back to them slowly, the way warmth does after real cold, and they sat with their hands wrapped around their cups, and nobody said anything for a while because they were all just breathing and being grateful for the walls. Then Pete said with great conviction, "I am too old for this," and Caroline said, "You say that every January," and Pete said, "And every January I am right," and Orville laughed and even Pete's mouth twitched, and Caroline looked at Orville over her broth cup with something that was entirely warm and entirely present in her face. He saw it. She saw him see it. And then she looked at her broth, and the moment passed, but it had existed, and it was real. February was quieter. The brutal cold of January gave way to a cold that was merely relentless rather than murderous, and the days began their gradual lengthening, the light stretching a few minutes further each day like something waking up slowly. Orville had been at the Easton Ranch for nearly 4 months. He had stopped thinking about the Callaway spread in Montana entirely. He had not sent word that he was delayed. It seemed clear, even to him, that he was not going to Montana. He was here. He had a conversation with himself about this, the kind of internal conversation that requires honesty, about what he wanted and what was realistic and what would be right. He wanted to stay. He wanted, with a depth that surprised him for its clarity, a future that was somehow organized around this woman and this land and the life she had built from the ruins of another life. He was not foolish enough to think he could replace Thomas. No one could replace Thomas. But he thought, with the careful, evidence-based confidence of a man who paid attention, that there might be room. That the future Caroline had described mourning, the children and the full house and the long life, that future was not gone. It had been deferred. And he wanted, more than he had wanted anything in a long time, to be part of rebuilding it. But he was equally clear that wanting something did not make it the right moment to say so. He had been watching Caroline for 4 months, and he knew that she was moving slowly in a direction that was toward rather than away. But she was moving at her own pace, in her own way, and the worst thing he could do was to reach for her before she had reached back. It was in February that the conversation happened, the real one. The one that, looking back, was the moment. Pete had gone into town for the day on an errand involving a dispute about a debt that he was owed by the man who ran the livery, and Caroline and Orville were alone on the ranch for the first time. They worked through the morning without particular comment on it, because there was nothing to comment on, and in the afternoon they sat on the porch in the thin February sun that was bright but still had no real warmth in it. And she had brought out 2 cups of coffee that were losing heat faster than either of them would have liked. They had been talking about the spring plans, the cattle, the south pasture, the fence repairs that needed doing in March, the practical logistics of a working ranch looking ahead to the next season. And then there was a pause, and in that pause, for some reason Orville never entirely identified, he said, "What was underneath it?" She turned to look at him. "Underneath what?" "The grief," he said. He said it gently and directly, without preamble, because he had been thinking about it for weeks, about the woman he kept glimpsing underneath the careful management, underneath the efficient widow, underneath the woman who had organized her loss into something workable. "You have been wearing it like a second skin for 3 years, but it is not all of you. I have been watching, and there is someone underneath it, and I wonder if you know who she is." The silence that followed was the most loaded silence he had ever sat inside. He could feel her processing it, not just the question but the fact that it had been asked. That someone had looked at her closely enough to ask. She set her coffee cup down on the porch railing with great deliberateness. She looked at the yard, at Solomon in the paddock, at the bare winter trees along the creek line. Her hands were in her lap and she was very still. "No," she said finally. And then she said something that clearly surprised her as she said it, the words coming out with the quality of discovery, as if she were finding something true for the first time in the moment of saying it. "I do not know who she is. I have not thought about who she is since before Thomas died. I have just been getting through days." She paused, and her voice was very quiet now. "I stopped asking what I wanted. I started asking what needed to be done. And that was how I survived it, and I am grateful for it. But I think somewhere in there I lost track of the rest of me." She was quiet for a long moment. "I did not realize I had lost track of it until you just asked me." Orville did not say anything. Sometimes the right response to someone saying something true is simply to let it exist without rushing in. After a long moment she said, "I think I am angry. I have not let myself be angry. It is not appropriate for a widow to be angry. You are supposed to be sad and dignified and grateful for what you had. But I am angry that he died. I am angry that the life we were planning was taken away." Her voice was even and steady and devastatingly controlled. I think I have been angry for 3 years, and I called it grief because grief is acceptable and anger is not. Anger is grief, Orville said quietly. They are not separate things. She turned and looked at him, and her eyes were very bright, and he could see that she was deciding something, actively deciding in the moment, whether to let herself feel it fully in front of another person for the first time. He watched the decision happen. He watched her choose, and then she cried. Not dramatically, not with sobs, but with a slow release of something that had been held under enormous pressure for an enormous amount of time, tears running down her face while she held herself perfectly still, her hands flat on her knees, like the rest of her was determined to keep its shape even as something central to it finally let go. She did not make a sound. She just cried with her whole face and let it happen. Orville did not touch her. Not because he did not want to, but because what she was doing was for herself and it needed to be for herself, and he was simply the witness. And witnessing it honestly and without flinching was the only thing he could offer that mattered. When it was over, which took a few minutes, she wiped her face with the back of her hand in a single decisive motion. She looked at him. Her face was blotched and her eyes were red, and she looked more alive than he had ever seen her look. "Well," she said, with a breath that was half laugh and half exhale. "Well," he agreed. "I think that has been waiting," she said. "I would say about 3 years," he said mildly. She made a sound that was definitely a laugh this time. "You are a very unusual man, Orville Wallace." "So I have been told," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, and the calculation was over, all the measuring and assessing and being careful. And what was in her face instead was just the plain fact of what she was feeling, which was that she trusted him, which was that she was glad he was here, which was, underneath all of it, something warmer and more specific than any of that. "I think," she said carefully, like she was testing the words, "that I have been waiting for someone to ask that question for a very long time." "I am glad I asked it," he said. She looked at him with those amber eyes that were still wet at the edges. "Why did you stay?" she asked. "Really?" He met her eyes directly. "Because I wanted to," he said. "Because this place felt right, and because you are the most remarkable woman I have ever met, and because being near you makes the world feel more real than it does without you." He said it the way he said everything, without performance, without drama, just the plain statement of a true thing. "I am not asking you for anything, Caroline. I am just answering your question honestly." She was quiet for a long time. The thin February sun moved a little further west. Solomon wandered to the fence to look at them with the benign curiosity of an old horse who has seen enough of human behavior to find it interesting but not alarming. "I'm not sure I know how to do this," she said, finally. "I got married at 22. I have not been anything other than a wife and then a widow. I do not quite know who I am outside of those two things, and I think I need to find out." "I know," he said. "I am not asking you to be anything. I am just here." She looked at the yard again. Then she said, with the quiet precision of a woman who chooses her words very deliberately, "I am glad you are here." And that was everything. That was, for that day, entirely enough. March came in with the first real suggestions of thaw, the creek running higher, the ground beginning its slow softening, the smell of things coming back to life that you do not notice until it is there, and then you cannot imagine forgetting it. With the thaw came the extra work that spring always brought, the fence repairs, the calving, the decisions about which pastures to open first and in what order. But the work had a different quality now. Something between them had opened up, slowly and without announcement, the way a door opens in a house that has been shut up all winter. They talked in the evenings. They talked about real things. She told him about her life before Wyoming, about growing up in Ohio with a father who was a school teacher and a mother who was one of those women who did 17 things at once and made all of them look effortless. She told him she had read every book in her father's study twice by the time she was 15, and that the books had made her want to see the West, that they had filled her with a longing for space and wildness that Ohio's tidy green hills did not satisfy. She had come west with Thomas, whose family had land in Wyoming Territory, and she had loved it the moment she saw it, the immensity of it, the sky, the particular quality of the light. He told her about himself, which he did not do easily or often, with the selective honesty of a man who has kept his own counsel for a long time. He told her he had grown up in Missouri, that his father had been a man of variable moods and reliable absences, and that he had left home at 16 and worked his way west over the following 15 years, ranch to ranch, learning everything there was to learn about cattle work and fence work and horses, accumulating a particular kind of competence that had no name but was recognizable when you saw it. He told her he had never settled because there had never been anywhere that asked him to stay. Until here, she said. Until here, he agreed. She looked at him across the kitchen table where they sat with the lamp between them, and she said with the directness that he loved about her, "Are you in love with me?" He held her gaze without any hesitation. "Yes," he said, "I think I have been for some time." She was quiet. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "I think," she said slowly, "that I am in love with you too, and that frightens me quite considerably." "I know it does," he said. "Because I loved Thomas and he died," she said. "And if I love you and something happens, something could always happen," he said gently. "That is the nature of caring about people. You cannot make yourself safe from loss by refusing to love. You only make yourself safe from love." She looked at him with an expression that had the quality of recognition, of hearing something true that you have already suspected but have not let yourself confirm. "When did you become so wise about these things?" "I have had a great deal of time to think," he said, "and no one to say any of it to." She almost smiled. Then she did smile, the whole machinery of it connecting at last, warm and full and entirely real, and it was the first full smile he had seen from her, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in his life. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, just that, her hand on his. He turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that for a long time in the lamplight while outside the Wyoming March wind moved through the pine trees with its cold and purposeful sound, and inside everything was warm. Spring came properly in April, which is when Wyoming allows it to arrive, reluctantly and then all at once. The calving was the most demanding period of the ranching year, and all three of them were working long hours, sometimes through the night when a cow needed help delivering. There was a night in the second week of April when Orville and Caroline were both up at 3 in the morning with a heifer who was struggling, and they worked together in the lantern-lit barn for 2 hours, careful and focused and steady, until the calf came safely, a small brown thing that stood on trembling legs and looked at the world with the enormous, confused surprise of the newborn. Caroline knelt in the straw and helped the calf find its footing, her hands gentle and sure, and the heifer turned her big head to look at her with the enormous trust that animals extend to the people who have helped them through the hardest moments, and Caroline said softly to the calf, "There you are. There you are, not performing anything, just the plain affection of a woman who loves animals and new things and beginnings." Orville crouched beside her and watched the calf take its first steps, and he thought, with the particular clarity that comes at 3 in the morning when you are past tired and into something cleaner, that this was what he wanted. This. Exactly this. The barn and the lantern and the cold night outside and this woman beside him in the straw with her hands that knew how to be gentle and capable at the same time. He said her name. She looked at him. And then in the barn at 3 in the morning with a calf just born and the hay smelling of winter and the lamp throwing warm gold light across everything, he kissed her for the first time. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was a quiet, careful, entirely certain kiss, and she kissed him back with the same quality of certainty, and when they separated she looked at him with those amber eyes and there was nothing guarded in them, nothing held back, nothing managed. Just her. "Well," she said for the second time, with a breath that contained a whole world. "Well," he agreed, and he was smiling, and she was smiling, and the calf wobbled sideways and nearly sat on him, and they both laughed and the night was suddenly warm and full. May brought Pete's retirement. The old man had been talking about it for 2 years with the theoretical quality of a man who does not actually plan to stop working. But in May of 1883, his rheumatism announced itself so severely that even Pete's stubbornness had to acknowledge the situation. He came to Caroline one morning with his hat in his hands and said he was sorry to leave her short-handed, and she said she was not going to let him apologize for 63-year-old knees, and she paid him 3 months' wages ahead and arranged for him to go stay with his sister in Laramie, where the winters were marginally less brutal. Pete shook Orville's hand on his way out and said, with the expression of a man stating something obvious, "You stay here. That is plain sense." And he climbed into the wagon and was driven off to Laramie, and the Easton ranch was down to 2. They hired a new hand in June, a young man of 20 named Danny Folks, who was earnest and capable, and who had the useful quality of not asking personal questions. With Danny taking over the work Pete had done, the distribution of labor at the ranch settled into a new rhythm that worked well, and Orville took on the foreman role without it being formally discussed, because it simply made sense, and because Caroline trusted his judgment in a way that was both practical and personal. The personal was growing. It was growing the way things grow when you stop being afraid of the growth and start being glad for it. They were not a secret, Orville and Caroline, in the sense of hiding anything, but they were also not a public declaration, because Caroline was still, in her own estimation, finding out who she was underneath the grief, and that process deserved privacy. But in the evenings, in the kitchen, in the morning with the coffee already made and the day stretching ahead, they were simply together, and it was the most natural thing that either of them had known. She opened the trunk. It was a Tuesday in June in the early evening. She did not announce it beforehand. Orville was on the porch with a book, and she came to the door and said, "I am going to open Thomas's trunk," with the tone of someone telling another person their plan so that the person knows where they are. He said, "All right." She went back inside. He heard nothing for a while. Then he heard very faintly the sound of something being unpacked, the soft handling of objects. He read his book and let her have the time. When she came out an hour later, she was carrying the daguerreotype book that she had mentioned months ago on the evening at the corral fence. She sat beside him on the porch and opened it, and she showed him the photographs of the northern Cheyenne Territory, the big wide land under the enormous sky, the exact images that Thomas had looked at in the evenings after supper. She turned the pages carefully, and she told Orville which photographs Thomas had looked at longest, and what Thomas had said about each one, and her voice was steady and fond and present. Not destroyed, not barely surviving, present. "He would have liked you," she said, turning a page. Orville looked at the photograph of a wide river with mountains behind it. "What makes you say so?" "Because you are honest," she said. He had no patience for men who performed themselves. He said it was wasted energy that could be spent on actual living. She glanced at Orville. "He would have recognized that you are a man who does not perform himself." "That is a high compliment," Orville said. "It is," she agreed. She looked at the last photograph in the book, the widest view, the sky that seemed to go on forever, the land beneath it infinite and strange. She touched the edge of it with one finger. "I am going to stop being a widow," she said. "Not because he did not matter. He mattered enormously, and he always will. But I think I have been a widow as a way of staying faithful to the life I lost, and I do not think that is what he would have wanted for me. I think he would have been angry about it, actually. He was a man who believed in people living." "He sounds like he was a very good man," Orville said. "He was," she said. "And so are you, in different ways." She closed the book and held it in her lap, and then she set it aside and turned to face him fully on the porch and said, "I do not want to be cautious anymore. I have been cautious for 3 years because it kept me safe, and it was all I had the energy for. But I think I have energy for more now." She held his gaze. "I think I want to be more than cautious." "What do you want to be?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment. "Happy," she said with a simplicity that contained a great deal. "I want to be happy, Orville. I think I had forgotten that was something I was allowed to want." He reached out and took her hand. "You are allowed to want it," he said. "You have always been allowed." She turned her hand in his and held it. "Ask me," she said. He looked at her. "Ask you what?" "You know what," she said. He did know what. He had known what he wanted for months, and he had been waiting patiently, actively, for her to be ready. And here was the readiness, standing in front of him with her amber eyes direct and open and certain. He took a breath. "Caroline Easton," he said, "will you marry me?" She smiled. The full smile, the real one, the one that moved all the way to her eyes and made them bright and warm and entirely alive. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He brought her hand to his mouth and kissed it, and she laughed, that real, unguarded laugh that he had been hearing more and more of. And the June evening was warm around them, and the ranch was quiet, and everything was right. They married in September of 1883, in the same church where they had stood together on Christmas Eve with the ginger cake, in a ceremony that was small and honest. Caroline wore a dress the color of deep blue, not black, not gray, but blue, the color of the Wyoming sky on a clear afternoon, and she walked to the front of the church with her chin up and her eyes bright. And Orville stood at the front and watched her come toward him with an expression that everyone in the church read differently, but that was, at its core, simply a man looking at the person he loves with all of his attention. The preacher kept it brief, because Caroline had asked him to. The vows they said to each other were the traditional ones, which suited both of them, because neither of them needed embellishment. The words were old and specific and true, and they meant them. Mrs. Beaumont cried. This was considered remarkable by everyone present, as Mrs. Beaumont was not generally believed capable of it. Pete came back from Laramie for the wedding, having organized the journey with great determination despite his knees. He sat in the second pew and blew his nose loudly at the conclusion of the ceremony, and told Orville afterward that this was the best outcome he had anticipated when he had recommended Caroline hire a stranger from off a horse that October morning, which was not entirely how it had gone. But Pete's version of events was offered with such warmth that no one saw fit to correct it. The celebration afterward was held at the Caldwell boarding house, which had the largest indoor space available in Millhaven, and people danced and ate and drank cider, and the fiddler played until 10 o'clock when Caroline's feet finally declared a limit, and she and Orville walked home in the September night under a sky so full of stars, it seemed to be trying to show off. They walked without speaking for a while, because the night was too beautiful for words to improve on. Then she put her hand through his arm and said, "I was afraid for a long time that I would not recognize happiness when I was in it, that I would look right at it and not see it. And now," he said. "I see it very clearly," she said. The ranch settled into its new shape over the following months with the easy naturalness of things finding their right arrangement. Orville had a fluency with the land that matched Caroline's, and together they made decisions that made the ranch more profitable than it had been even in Thomas's time, not because Thomas had managed it poorly, but because two people working in genuine partnership, both of them competent, both of them trusting each other's judgment, made things possible that one person managing alone cannot achieve. They took on a second additional hand in the spring of 1884, an older man named Samuel who had grown up ranching in Kansas, and who brought with him a specific expertise in cattle health that proved extremely useful. The injustices of the territory continued around them, the ongoing displacement of the Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples from their lands, the slow encroachment of settlement and legislation onto the reservations, the complex and painful process of a government making decisions that were legal but not right. Caroline and Orville talked about this, as they talked about everything, with the directness that had become the foundation of their life together. They were not in a position to change federal policy, and they knew it, but they extended what practical decency they could, which meant fair dealings with any person who came to the ranch regardless of origin, which meant refusing to participate in the convenient fictions that the territory told itself about whose land this had been, and which meant raising their children when they came, with a clear-eyed account of that history. The children. The first came in the spring of 1885. A boy, born on an April morning that was bright and cold, delivered by the doctor from Millhaven, who arrived with 20 minutes to spare, and declared the whole thing remarkably well organized, which was a quality he attributed to Caroline being the kind of woman who approached even childbirth with preparation. The boy was healthy and loud, and had Orville's gray-green eyes and Caroline's auburn coloring, and he was named Thomas William Wallace. Thomas for the obvious reason, and William for Orville's younger brother who had died of fever at age 9, and who Orville had never stopped missing in the particular, enduring way that you miss someone you lose too young. Orville held his son for the first time sitting on the edge of the bed beside Caroline, who was exhausted and shining with it, and he looked at the small, definite face of Thomas William, and felt something open up in his chest so enormously that he thought for a moment that the room had actually gotten bigger. Caroline watched him hold the baby. She watched the expression on his face, the one that was past language, past performance, just the plain enormity of it. She reached out and touched his arm. "Well," she said very quietly. He looked at her. He could not speak for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you," with a simplicity that carried everything. She smiled. The full smile, the real one. "He looks like you," she said. "He looks like you," Orville said. "Both of us," she decided, and looked at her son with an expression of such complete and uncomplicated love that Orville thought he understood something, finally, about what she had been saying when she talked about the future she had lost with Thomas. The future with the children and the full house and the long life. That future had not been lost. It had been rerouted. It was here in this room on this April morning, in a different shape than she had imagined it, but present and warm and real. Thomas William was 6 months old when Caroline caught Orville sitting on the porch with the baby in his arms, telling the boy about the proper way to assess a fence line, very seriously, as if the information were urgent and needed to be transmitted immediately before the opportunity was lost. Thomas William, who was 6 months old and had no opinions yet about fence lines, regarded him with the focused attention of the very young. Caroline stood in the doorway and watched them and felt the happiness so completely that it almost frightened her, and then she thought about Orville's words from that February porch, about making yourself safe from love only making you safe from love, and she let the happiness be full. The second child arrived in the summer of 1887. Another boy, which surprised them both only slightly less than the first had surprised them. He arrived on a hot July night that was the opposite of Thomas William's cold April morning in every possible way, with the windows open to whatever breeze existed, and the doctor arriving this time with almost an hour to spare, which he seemed to feel was an improvement. They named him James Henry Wallace, Henry for Caroline's father, who had died 2 years earlier and who she had loved deeply, and James because Orville had always liked the name and had no particular explanation for it, and Caroline said that liking a name was reason enough. James Henry was a different creature than Thomas William from the start. Where Thomas William was quiet and focused, James Henry was loud and social and engaged with everything around him at maximum volume. He laughed before Thomas William had laughed. He walked before Thomas William had walked. He also fell over more frequently and minded it less. The two brothers circled each other with the complicated, warm, occasionally chaotic dynamic of siblings who are genuinely fond of each other and would deny it if asked. Thomas William was 4 when James Henry was born, and he stood at the edge of the room after the baby arrived, looking at this new addition with the serious, assessing expression of a child who is processing new information. He said, "Is he staying?" And Orville said, "He is." And Thomas William considered this for a long moment and then said, "All right," with the air of a person making a significant concession, and went out to see the horses. By 1888, the Easton Wallace Ranch, which had quietly kept both names because Caroline had proposed it and Orville had agreed without discussion, had grown to be one of the more successful operations in that part of Wyoming. Not the biggest, not the grandest, but the kind of place that had a reputation for being well-run and fair, and that reputation was worth something in the territory, where the networks of trust and word of mouth that connected ranching families were the invisible infrastructure on which the whole enterprise ran. They had dinner with the Caldwells and the new minister and his wife, and Caroline sat at the table and talked and laughed and had opinions, and no one in the room could have imagined, looking at her, the woman who had stood at the edges of rooms 3 years running and made the music feel inappropriate. That woman had not disappeared. She was part of Caroline, part of what she knew about herself, part of the depth of her, but she was not the whole. She was not the skin anymore. Pete came to visit every summer, his knees permitting the journey, and he sat on the porch with Orville in the evenings, and commented on the state of the fence line with the evaluative authority of a man who had informed opinions about fence lines. And he played with the boys with a grandparental warmth that was touching in someone who had previously seemed to exist outside the range of emotions that required physical demonstration. Thomas William called him Uncle Pete with complete comfort, and James Henry called him something that was clearly intended to be Pete, but came out as something else entirely for 2 years, which Pete appeared to find enormously pleasing. On an evening in the autumn of 1888, October again, 6 years almost to the month from when Orville had ridden into Millhaven on Clover looking for supplies and ended up changing his life, they sat on the porch in the cooling evening. The boys were in bed. Danny Folks and Samuel had gone to the bunkhouse after supper. The ranch was quiet around them in the particular way that a place is quiet when it is full of the right things. Caroline leaned against Orville's shoulder, which was a habit she had developed and which he had accommodated with the ease of something entirely natural, and they watched the stars come out one at a time over the eastern hills. 6 years, she said. About that, he said. She was quiet for a moment. I have been thinking about the trunk, she said. He did not need to ask which trunk. About the fact that I did not open it for 2 years and how opening it was the right thing and how I could not have opened it before I was ready. And, he said, and I think the grief was a door, she said. I thought it was a wall. I thought it was something to be endured and gotten past, but it was not. It was a door and I had to go through it, not around it or over it or away from it. I had to go through it. She paused. You asked me what was underneath it and I did not know until I said it. What was underneath it? He asked gently, seriously, as if asking for the first time. She turned her head and looked at him. Me, she said, just me. The woman who wanted to be happy and who was allowed to want it. The woman who could love again and not lose herself in the loving but be more herself for it. She held his gaze. You. He looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had been wrapped in grief like a second skin when he met her. This woman who had laughed with him over a heifer stuck in a ditch. Who had cried on a February porch and wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked more alive than he had ever seen her. Who had said yes to him on a summer evening with the full smile that moved all the way to her eyes. This woman who was his wife and who had given him 2 sons and a home and the extraordinary privilege of a life that felt entirely, specifically, correctly right. I love you, he said. I know you do, she said. I love you. She settled back against his shoulder. I've become so good at being loved by you that sometimes I forget it was once something I did not think I could allow myself to feel again. Do you forget it often? He asked. No, she said comfortably. Just enough to remind me that it happened, that I was there and now I am here. The October night was cold in the clean, particular way that Wyoming nights are cold, the kind of cold that is beautiful rather than brutal, that makes the stars look nearer and the silence sound full rather than empty. Solomon's paddock was visible from the porch, and the old horse stood in the moonlight with the absolute stillness of very old horses, present and tranquil. He was 23 years old now, which was exceptional. Caroline had maintained that he would outlive all of them out of sheer dignity, and she was possibly right. The boys would wake in the morning, Thomas William with his serious gray-green eyes and James Henry with his extraordinary enthusiasm for breakfast. And there would be coffee to make and cattle to check and fence lines to walk and ledgers to balance. And Samuel would have a question about the south pasture rotation, and Danny would need instructions for the week. And there would be all of it, the full and ordinary and extraordinary weight of a life being lived. But now, on the porch in October, in the stars and the cold and the quiet, it was just the two of them as it had been on a February porch 5 years ago when everything had shifted. She had not known then what was underneath the grief. She had not known until she said it. She knew now. He put his arm around her, and she was warm against his side, and the ranch settled around them into the deep hush of a place that is exactly what it is supposed to be. And Caroline Easton, who was Caroline Wallace now, but who kept her first name's history close like something worth keeping, exhaled a breath that was clear and full and entirely free. The stars came out fully over the Wyoming hills. The old horse stood patient in the moonlight. The children slept, and the life they had built from the particular ruins of love and grief and courage and plain, patient, ordinary attention to one another was real and whole and theirs, and it would be theirs for a very long time.